Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the Answer Company. The division championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Sheridan Dulas & Kins, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News and World Report every year since 2009, Sheridan Dulas & Kins are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Pleasure to have you joining us today. I have the privilege and pleasure of interviewing an old friend of mine. Old is not in terms of your age, but old in terms of how long we've known each other. Susie Brown is the president of the Minnesota Council on Foundations. And we have to tell people, Susie, you and I have known each other about 15 years since we both were working at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Susie, welcome to Access to Democracy.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
So, tell our viewers, where did you grow up and go to school? You're not originally from Minnesota.
I am.
Or you are?
Yes. I grew up in a little community in the St. Croix Valley called St. Croix Beach. And the St. Croix Valley is a long, skinny community that all the kids commute up to Stillwater for high school. So I graduated from Stillwater High School in 1986.
I think what got me confused about that was the fact that you went out of state to go to college.
Yes.
And where did you go to school?
Yes, I went to Oregon, to Lewis and Clark College, which is in Portland, Oregon, which I happened to meet my spouse there. He's from Roseville. And our daughter just graduated from there in May.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, what inspired you to seek a career working in the nonprofit sector and with philanthropy?
Yeah.
Did you have any mentors or people who inspired you to go this direction?
It's an inspiring field, so I'd say I had a lot of people who inspired me along the way. I started in this field in the nonprofit sector when I was right out of college, and there was a body of work that was of interest to me personally. And like many people in the nonprofit sector, I started as a volunteer in an organization that I felt some affinity toward. And I ended up working there and building the early part of my career there, and that really launched me into a career in nonprofit advocacy. And then as the time went on, I have turned into philanthropy as the current stage of my career.
And when you and I first met, you were the new public policy director at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We were working with our good friends John Pratt and Marcia Avner, right? That was way back in 2010?
2010 is when I started there, and I had a couple of roles in nonprofit advocacy prior to that in specific issue areas, and at that point really understood the power of a sector working together, which really is what inspired me to go to the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits to do work on behalf of the whole nonprofit sector.
That's great. We're going to be delving into that in much more detail here. So I want to ask you to tell our viewers, What is the Minnesota Council on Foundations?
Sure.
What does your organization do? What is its mission?
Great. The Minnesota Council on Foundations is the community of grant-making institutions in the state of Minnesota. There are a variety of types of grant-making institutions. There is private philanthropy. In private philanthropy, there are family foundations and independent foundations. There is corporate philanthropy. A lot of corporations in this community are very dedicated to giving back. That's actually a rich part of our corporate history in the state of Minnesota. And then there are community foundations throughout the state of Minnesota. There are large, very large community foundations that have lots of staff and lots of resources. And there are little teeny tiny community foundations that are run by a handful of volunteers in a really small area. So our organization brings them all together. We believe in the power of working together. And we worked through 3 basic strategies to connect, strengthen, and mobilize the field of philanthropy. So that's the work that we do.
And so if I understand it correctly, and I hope I do, that the philanthropy sector that your organization, that MCF represents, you make it possible, or I should say they make it possible through their grant making for organizations that may provide direct services to clients.
Exactly. The foundations in the Minnesota Council on Foundations community provide grants to nonprofits, and those nonprofits carry out critical work in the community. So we really provide some fuel and support to the nonprofit sector.
I want to circle back to a point that you just made a moment ago about Minnesota's rich legacy of philanthropy. Say a little bit more about that. How is it that Minnesota came to be home to some of the greatest philanthropic organizations in the country?
Yeah, well, there was really strong leadership decades ago by the Dayton family. And the Dayton family, was one of the corporate leaders. There were many other really important corporate leaders in this community. But there was an effort to encourage all of these corporations and corporate leaders to give back a certain percent, 5%, to the community. And that really started right here, and
was
many.
Was that 5% of their pre-tax profits? I thought I read
so.
something like that.
I think so. But in any case, it really was an effort to organize corporate leaders to be intentional in their commitments to giving back to the community. So that was a very important part of corporate life many
decades ago. And it wasn't just
ago.
that these companies like Dayton's, which obviously founded Target too, they weren't just here to make money, they were here to give back to the community where they lived.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And really built many of our cultural institutions and our important service institutions that really have provided supports for the community for many years. It really, we are different here. That kind of activity from our corporate sector really launched a commitment that's been enduring. And we've had some incredible individual leaders of corporations who have gone on to establish foundations in their families' names.
Thinking of like the Cargill Foundation.
Exactly.
McKnight Foundation,
yes.
Wilder Foundation. Did I mention the big ones there? A
few
of
the
the big
Bush
ones.
Foundation.
Bush Foundation,
yes.
right.
So many of those foundations came out of the families that provided leadership for some of these corporations.
Many people have observed about Minnesota that we have for a state of our size, now we're just under 6 million people, I believe. For a state of our size, we have a disproportionate number of highly successful Fortune 500 companies. And some of these are relatively new to the scene. They're newer than some of the older companies that were here in high tech and in medical devices in particular. And so we've had this ethic here in Minnesota of companies that have been very successful, highly profitable through their activities around the world, but they've chosen to reinvest in our community.
Yeah, they have.
It's been a really great thing for us, hasn't it?
It has been a really great thing, and hometown giving for these corporations is a really important part of what has supported and sustained and built much of the civic infrastructure that we rely on here in Minnesota.
Somebody once said to me, they said, doing good inspires good. And so when to your point about these foundations and the tremendous work they do in Minnesota, all over our state, that when you see that, it inspires other foundations or other companies to do similar things.
Yes, yes, indeed. There is an interest in doing better together.
Right.
And that's what we try to inspire at the Minnesota Council on Foundations, is come together as a community of grant makers that cares about supporting our infrastructure, services, arts, civics, and we can do it together.
So how many members are there of the Minnesota Council on
We have
Foundations?
about 170 members, and they're mostly concentrated in the Twin Cities, but we are a statewide organization. They're mostly concentrated in the Twin Cities because
That's where the population is.
It's where the population is, it's where the corporations are, it's where many family offices are. But we have statewide representation, and our community foundations are certainly throughout the state. We also have a group of organizations called the Minnesota Initiative Foundations, which were actually launched by McKnight Foundation in the 80s. That are in each of 6 regions throughout the state. So about 170 members, and very roughly they're about a third family foundations, corporate foundations, and community foundations, and the remaining 10%-ish is independent foundations.
Very good. Can you give us, not to put you on the spot, and I don't think it will, but give us an example or two, if you would, Susie, of how philanthropic grants have improved our community and advanced a more equitable society here in Minnesota. That's one of your organization's goals. How has that happened through some of the grant making that they have done?
Yeah, well, there are so many specific grants that happen. I don't think I'll name
If you don't
just
want to mention
one.
specific, but just give us an example perhaps of some of the kind of work they have done that has made our community stronger.
Sure. I guess the thing that we do, the main thing that we do, is distribute money to the organizations that seek resources to do their good work. So a lot of what we do is try to be responsive to what the community needs are, what organizations say that they need resources to support. That's a main strategy.
Would it be fair to say that you're somewhat of a bridge between nonprofits and donors?
We are the donors. We are the donors, yes.
But do you connect them to specific nonprofits?
Yes, I can talk about that in just a second with donor advised funds, which are a particular type of
giving,
donating that happens through community foundations. But what I'll say is that while people understand our transactional role of giving money to nonprofits that need it so they can carry out their good work, there are other ways that we can build capacity and put together programs that are collective work of philanthropy. And I think that's one of the kind of special ways that we can advance equity, that we can do bigger things than just giving grants. One example right now that the McKnight Foundation is leading is called Ground Break, and that's where philanthropy has come together and has engaged other sectors, the financial industry and local governments, to try to put together a variety of financing and funding that will support particular initiatives in communities to build housing and to provide support to small businesses. So where there might not be just a foundation grant needed, but other types of financing needed, sometimes philanthropy can come together to kind of put a number of resources together through institutions cooperating. That's one example at this moment that's happening in our community.
Very good. I want to ask you about something that's been all over the news the past week or so. The Trump administration has launched an all-out assault on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, both in government and in the private sector. I'm curious about your thoughts about this action by the new Trump administration.
I'm not in favor of it. I think that many actions that are happening right now by the Trump administration are kind of trial balloons to test some of the constitutional protections and legal structures, civic structures that we count on. So I don't know where all these things are going to go. I think in terms of DEI specifically, the philanthropic community has long been committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, advancing these things through our own organizations.
That's part of your core mission,
absolutely,
isn't it?
And through our grant making. At this moment, our approach is to stay the course. We're largely private institutions that are able to make our own choices about how we carry out our work, and if there are ways that we can carry out work that that might remedy past injustices, that would be of interest to many of our members.
Susie, I want to dig a little bit deeper on this DEI issue. Isn't there a lot of misrepresentation going on right now from the administration about what DEI is? I've heard various people from the administration on the news saying, oh, it's requiring employers to hire people who are not qualified. The president himself, after the tragedy on the Potomac River, the mid-air collision, suggested that it was DEI within the Federal Aviation Administration that caused the crash, offering no evidence whatsoever to support that proposition. Isn't this a problem when there's this kind of misinformation about what DEI is? Does DEI say that government or private sector has to hire people who are unqualified?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think in the field of philanthropy, we really value having different perspectives, voices, life experience around the table in our work for our leadership and our decision making. We believe that a diversity of views and voices and experiences makes us stronger as organizations. There isn't anything that is coming out of the current administration that suggests to our organization that it's not okay to value a diversity of voices to make us a stronger organization.
Actually, isn't there an even more malignant assumption behind some of the attacks on DEI, assuming, for example, that people of color are unfit to do certain jobs, that women may not be qualified to do certain jobs, that LGBTQ people or transgender people are not fit to serve in our military, protecting our country, even though they have been there for years?
These are very hurtful concepts. We don't ascribe to them in philanthropy, and I guess there's a lot of things we could talk about happening at the federal level.
On that.
But maybe it'd be better to talk more about philanthropy.
Well, I ask because DEI is a core part of philanthropy and your organization and trying to advance a more equitable society where everyone has an even shot at achieving the American dream.
Exactly. And philanthropy distributes resources and has an opportunity to do so in a way that can right some wrongs from our history. I will say that there was a challenge to philanthropic effort called the Fearless Fund, not in Minnesota, but it was a legal challenge to a fund that provided resources for a very specific group, Black women entrepreneurs. And that was challenged in another court system. So I think philanthropy is aware that there are people who are intent on challenging lots of types of programs where the effort might be directed to people whose lives or circumstances have not had the same opportunities in our society. I think we know that there may be
impediments
and
to
impediments
people being hired, and discrimination.
Indeed. So we're aware that those kinds of challenges can happen. And we also realize that we have an opportunity to stick to our values, stick to our work, keep our heads up, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, I think for many people who look at this situation that's unfolding now, they have a very strong conviction that we ought to have a government and we ought to have a private sector that reflects the American people in all of their diversity. We're a very diverse country. We come from all sorts of different political points of view, different racial, ethnic, religious backgrounds, and more. And there should be a place for everyone.
And that makes us stronger.
Yep.
In our community and in our institutions.
Let's move on. I'd like to ask you about your work with independent sector. And tell us about that. You work in coalition, as I understand it, with various groups in Minnesota, other nonprofits. Say a word, if you would, particularly about your public policy work with other groups.
Sure. We are really dedicated to working in close partnership. That's how public policy happens. It doesn't really happen by one person or entity saying, we want this thing. It happens by building groups of people who share objectives and may come at it from slightly different perspectives. So we're very dedicated to working in coalition. Excuse me. In the state of Minnesota, our closest coalition partner is the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, where you and I used to work. And at the federal level, we're very closely allied with Independent Sector, which is a national membership association that includes both foundations and nonprofits. And we're also very close partners with the National Council on Foundations, so that's like our organization, but across the nation, the National Council of Nonprofits, and a group called the United Philanthropy Forum. And we're fortunate we have an amazing vice president of policy and partnerships at MCF. Her name is Katina Mortensen, my colleague, and she is on the National Policy Committee for United Philanthropy Forum. So we're lucky we have a direct connection there with one of our leaders in Minnesota influencing and being at the table with our national partners.
So Susie, how does an organization like MCF, how do you determine which issues you're going to work in coalition or collaboration with other groups?
Sure.
On public policy?
Well, some of the way we determine that is through our members. What is of interest to our members? What are the issues that are important to them? And then our work in coalition with others is largely around protecting some of the major concepts of democracy and civic institutions, where we do a lot of work in coalition on a range of democracy issues that we believe, undergird our society, and philanthropy is best able to do its job in a strong democracy. So we work on voter issues, we work on the census, we work on a number of issues
to make sure that the census counts all people, reaches all people.
Exactly.
Because that's what determines political representation.
And it helps us get data and understanding about our own communities. That helps philanthropy and nonprofits do their jobs better. So we work across sectors in coalition around democracy issues. And then we work in coalition around issues that we call protecting the sector, which is basically public policy issues that strengthen nonprofits and philanthropy, that strengthen giving, individual giving to nonprofits, that strengthen aspects of the tax code that kind of undergird our organizational structures.
I wanted to ask you about one of those issues in particular, which is on your website. If viewers want to learn more about these issues, your website is?
www.mcf.org.
The issue I wanted to zero in on and ask you to explain this one, what is the universal charitable deduction? Why is this important?
Charitable deductions for individual donors are available variously at the state and federal level, and there are ways that they can be improved. In the state of Minnesota, we have a non-itemizer deduction, so people who don't itemize their taxes.
Which is most people, isn't it?
Well, yes.
I think
mean,
it's
in the
most people
first
don't itemize.
Trump administration, the standard deduction went way up,
Right.
and so most people don't itemize. So we're fortunate in the state of Minnesota that we have a non-itemizer deduction that's available to people. That is both, useful for people in their own taxes, but it's also considered an incentive for giving, that there's a tax incentive for giving. Mm-hmm. At the federal level, there was a universal deduction, meaning it applied to all taxpayers.
Whether you itemize
exactly.
or not. Yeah.
That was, I guess I'll say, turned on during COVID times with some limitations, but there was a policy effort to incentivize charitable giving. Mm-hmm. And that expired, and so the idea of the universal deduction is to bring something like that back, which really extends the charitable giving incentive to federal taxpayers.
And as I recall, that was particularly important during the COVID pandemic because nonprofits were being called upon to do more than ever with their limited resources.
Exactly.
And so that kind of a deduction for people would be terribly important to nonprofits in being able to get the revenue that they needed.
Yes, that's right. Yes. We're taking a delegation of foundation representatives to Washington, D.C. at the end of this month.
To meet with our congressional
delegation, and this is certainly one of the things we'll be discussing.
Reminds me of my old days, making those trips for the Council of Nonprofits.
Yeah.
And back then, and even still, fortunately, we have a congressional delegation that is happy to receive the message.
Sure.
Good to meet with them. Well, I want to ask you, Susie, what do you think the future of philanthropy looks like in Minnesota?
That's a big one.
Where are we headed given what's happening, the tremendous changes we see in our society with growing economic inequality, lots of changes to government programs happening as we speak, the cancellation of government programs. What do you think the future is philanthropy here in Minnesota and maybe nationally?
Yeah. I mean, philanthropy will always be an important piece of the puzzle. If you look at philanthropy compared to government, it's a drop in the bucket, for sure. But philanthropy has the ability to be more nimble and flexible than government funding. And so I do think there's continued, conversation or movement toward how does philanthropy show up as a really good partner to government in ways that fill in things that government can't do. Innovation, moving quickly, providing support where there are gaps. So what's the future of philanthropy, I think, is really working in close partnership with government so our resources are put to the best use.
So what I hear you saying, if I understand correctly, is government can't do the whole job by themselves. There aren't enough programs to address the needs in our country in all kinds of fields, but neither can the nonprofit sector and philanthropy.
For sure.
That there has to be this kind of synergy or partnership, if you will, of people working collaboratively together.
Yes, exactly. And philanthropy can do things differently than government. Mm-hmm. So an example of that is we partnered with the administration, the state administration, around some COVID funds at the time when there were state funds that could pay for certain COVID vaccine opportunities, and there were federal funds that could pay for some others, but there were gaps, that there were no funds, for example, that could pay for outreach to people who didn't speak English, who were unhoused. And private philanthropy can come in there and provide some support for that.
Susie Brown, president of the Minnesota Council on Foundations, thank you for being our guest on Access to Democracy today to talk about the great work your organization and philanthropy does in our state. And to our viewers, thank you for watching Access to Democracy.
Thanks, Steve.